The sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the mountain range, casting the valley below in a shadow that deepened the chill in the air. Jason and Mark, lifelong friends and seasoned adventurers, stood at the entrance of a cave that had no name on any map they could find. Its opening yawned before them, a dark maw in the mountainside that seemed to swallow the fading light. They had heard rumors from the locals, whispers of strange sounds and disappearing hikers, but the thrill of discovery outweighed the ominous warnings. "Let's go, man," Mark said, his voice echoing slightly as he adjusted his headlamp and stepped inside. Jason followed, the beam of his own light cutting through the dense darkness. The air inside was cool, carrying a faint, musty scent that hinted at the cave's untouched nature. The walls were rough, carved by centuries of natural forces, and glittered with veins of minerals that glistened under their lights. As they ventured deeper, the cave grew narrower, forcing them to squeeze through tight passages that opened into larger chambers. Each step forward brought an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water or the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. They reached a fork in the tunnel. Mark wanted to explore the left path, drawn by the faint sound of running water, while Jason felt an inexplicable pull to the right, where the air seemed heavier, thicker. "I think we should split up," Jason suggested, a decision neither of them would live to regret. Mark hesitated, but his curiosity about the water sound won over his caution. They agreed to meet back at the fork in an hour and went their separate ways. Jason's path wound downward, the air growing colder with each step. The walls here were smoother, almost polished, as if something had been down here before, something that had shaped this tunnel. His headlamp flickered, casting shifting shadows that danced just out of view, and a shiver ran down his spine. The silence was oppressive now, the weight of the mountain above pressing down on him. He noticed strange markings on the walls, unfamiliar symbols carved deep into the stone, almost pulsating with a faint light. The air grew colder still, and a foul stench began to permeate the tunnel, a smell of decay and something far worse that he couldn't identify. Then he heard it, a low guttural growl echoing from the depths ahead. Jason froze, his breath hitching as the sound reverberated through the narrow passage. It was a noise that didn't belong in this world, primal and filled with a malevolent hunger. He turned to retreat, but the tunnel behind him seemed to have shifted, the way back twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Panic set in as he realized he was no longer alone in the dark. Meanwhile, Mark's journey had led him to a small underground stream, the water crystal clear as it trickled over smooth stones. He knelt to take a closer look, mesmerized by how pristine it was in such a desolate place. But as he bent down, he noticed something out of place. A dark, viscous substance mixed with the water. He dipped his finger in it, recoiling immediately as a sharp pain shot through his hand. The liquid was acidic, burning his skin with an intensity that made him gasp. A sudden noise from the tunnel behind him made Mark spin around, his heart pounding. The sound was like claws scraping against stone, growing louder, closer. His headlamp flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, he felt a presence, something large and powerful, moving just beyond the edge of his light. "Jason?" Mark called out, but his voice echoed back to him, distorted, as if the cave itself was mocking him. The scraping sound stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Mark's breath quickened as he realized the presence was no longer in the tunnel behind him. It was in the room with him. He spun around, shining his light frantically, but there was nothing there. Just shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. Then he saw them. Two glowing eyes in the darkness, watching him with an intelligence that sent a jolt of pure terror through his body. He backed away slowly, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, but the eyes followed, unblinking. A low growl rumbled through the cave, shaking the ground beneath him. Mark turned and ran, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind him, gaining ground with each passing second. The tunnel twisted and turned, but he kept running, driven by a primal fear he had never known before. Jason, meanwhile, had found himself in a large chamber, the ceiling lost in the shadows above. The markings on the walls were more prominent here, covering every inch of the stone surface. In the center of the room was an altar of sorts, carved from the very rock, and atop it, a small glowing object. It was an artifact of some kind, ancient and alien in design, pulsing with a sickly light that seemed to reach out to him. He approached it cautiously, drawn by a force he couldn't understand, but as he reached out to touch it, A voice echoed in his mind, a whisper that grew louder until it was a deafening roar. "You should not be here." Jason stumbled back, clutching his head as pain lanced through his skull. The voice continued, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but the message was clear. They had awakened something that had been asleep for millennia, and it was angry. He tried to turn and run, but his body refused to obey, paralyzed by an unseen force. The ground beneath him trembled, and from the darkness, a figure began to emerge. It was massive, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The creature was not of this world, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and shadow, its limbs ending in razor-sharp claws that scraped against the stone as it advanced. Its mouth, lined with rows of jagged teeth, opened wide as it emitted a guttural growl that shook the very air around him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to break free from the invisible grip holding him in place. The creature loomed over him, its foul breath washing over him as it leaned in closer, its eyes boring into his soul. Desperation surged through him as he managed to force his legs to move, stumbling backward just as the creature lunged. He bolted through the tunnel, the sound of the beast's pursuit echoing in his ears. The tunnel twisted and turned, but he didn't stop, driven by the primal instinct to survive. Mark, too, was running, his lungs burning as he raced through the dark. He could hear Jason's footsteps ahead, and relief flooded him as he caught sight of his friend's light. "Jason!" Mark shouted, but the sound was drowned out by the creature's roar. They were close now, the fork in the tunnel just ahead. If they could make it there, maybe, just maybe, they could escape. But as they neared the junction, the tunnel ahead suddenly collapsed, the ceiling caving in with a deafening crash. They skidded to a halt, trapped between the falling debris and the creature closing in behind them. Jason looked at Mark, his eyes wide with fear and hopelessness. "We have to keep moving," he gasped, but the path was blocked. There was no way forward. The creature's growl grew louder as it approached, the sound of its claws scraping against the stone sending shivers down their spines. Mark's mind raced, searching for any way out, but the walls were too smooth to climb, and the tunnel too narrow to slip past the creature. "We can't outrun it," Jason said, his voice trembling, "but maybe we can outsmart it." "What are you talking about?" Mark demanded, panic rising in his chest. Jason's eyes flicked to the walls, to the symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light. "These symbols," he said, "they're not just decoration. They're some kind of seal, something that was keeping it trapped. If we can reactivate them, maybe we can stop it." Mark stared at him in disbelief. "How do you know that?" "I don't," Jason admitted, "but it's our only chance." They had no time to argue. The creature was nearly upon them, its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. Jason and Mark split up, each moving to opposite sides of the tunnel, frantically searching for a way to trigger the symbols. Mark's fingers brushed against a hidden mechanism in the wall, and with a click, one of the symbols flared to life, glowing brightly. Jason did the same on his side, and the symbols began to light up, one by one forming a barrier of light between them and the creature. But the creature was relentless. It crashed into the barrier, its claws tearing at the light, and with each strike, the barrier weakened. They were running out of time. Come on, Jason shouted, his hands moving faster as he tried to activate the last of the symbols. But the creature was too strong. With a final deafening roar, it shattered the barrier, lunging at Jason with a speed that defied its size. Mark watched in horror as the creature's claws sank into Jason's chest, lifting him off the ground as it roared in triumph. Jason's scream echoed through the cave, a sound of pure agony that was cut off as the creature's jaws closed around his neck, silencing him forever. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline, the fight or flight response kicking in. With one last desperate effort, Mark activated the final symbol. A blinding light exploded from the walls, the symbols burning with an intensity that seared into his retinas. The creature let out a monstrous howl, its form writhing as the light enveloped it, tearing at its shadowy flesh. Mark stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the light. He watched as the creature struggled against the glowing barrier, its body twisting and contorting in a grotesque display. For a moment, he thought they had won, that the ancient seal would contain the monster once more. But then, with a roar that shook the very foundation of the cave, the creature shattered the barrier, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of darkness that surged toward Mark. He turned and ran, blind with fear, the light from the symbols flickering and dying behind him as the creature pursued him through the tunnels. His heart pounded in his chest. the adrenaline surging through his veins as he raced through the dark, the creature's guttural growls echoing off the walls. He knew there was no escape, that the tunnels would eventually lead him to a dead end, and the beast would be upon him. But then he saw it, a faint glimmer of light ahead, the cave's entrance. Mark pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the light. The creature was close, its presence pressing in on him, the air thick with its malevolent energy. With one final burst of speed, Mark threw himself out of the cave, tumbling onto the rocky slope outside. He scrambled to his feet and ran down the mountain, the creature's roars fading into the distance behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the valley below, his lungs burning and his legs trembling. Only then did he dare to look back, expecting to see the creature charging down the mountain after him. But there was nothing. The cave's entrance was just a dark spot in the mountainside, silent and still. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rocks, as if the cave had swallowed the creature whole, trapping it inside once more. Mark collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the reality of what had happened crashing down on him. Jason was gone, taken by the ancient evil they had foolishly awakened, and Mark knew that he had barely escaped with his life, a fact that filled him with a deep, gnawing guilt. He stared up at the cave, its dark entrance now just a shadow in the fading light. He knew he could never go back, that the mountain held secrets best left buried. But as he sat there, trembling in the growing darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The wind picked up, a low, mournful howl that echoed through the valley, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. "You should not have come." Mark's heart skipped a beat, his blood turning to ice as the words seemed to seep into his mind, a warning that he knew he couldn't ignore. He stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, and began the long, lonely trek back to civilization. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was watching him, that the creature was still out there, waiting for him to return. And deep within the cave, in the darkness that no light could reach, the creature stirred, its hunger growing as it waited for its next prey. Mark knew he would never be free of it, that the ancient evil they had awakened would haunt him for the rest of his days. And as he disappeared into the night, he realized with a sickening certainty that the cave had not let him go, it had merely let him live for now. But one day, the mountain would call him back, and when it did, he knew he wouldn't be able to resist. The cave was waiting, and the creature would be ready.